Oklahoma's known for cowboys and wide-open land. But dig a little deeper, and you'll find something older, stranger. Ancient carvings, burial mounds, cave paintings, and legends of giants hint at a forgotten past. Some stories trace back to native cultures. Others defy explanation. These are Oklahoma's ancient mysteries. Unsettling, fascinating, and still unsolved. The Heavener Runestone. If you ever find yourself deep in the forests of southeastern Oklahoma, near a quiet little town called Heavener, there's a place that feels just a bit out of time. Hidden among the trees, resting against the mossy hillside, is a huge slab of sandstone, 12 feet tall and 10 feet wide. Carved right into its surface are symbols that look like something straight out of a Viking saga. This is the Heavener Runestone. People have been wondering about this thing for decades. Some say it's proof that Norse explorers reached the American heartland long before Columbus ever crossed the Atlantic. Others believe it's the work of 19th century Scandinavian immigrants who brought their culture and stories with them to a new home. Either way, the stone is real, and it's raising questions that still don't have a clear answer. Let's take a closer look. Locals had known about the Heavener Runestone long before anyone started writing articles about it. Back in the early 1900s, kids used to play near it. Families just saw it as part of the landscape, something curious, sure, but not necessarily historical. That changed in the 1920s, when the stone caught the attention of researchers. The runes on it, those strange, sharp-edged letters, look a lot like the ancient writing systems used by Viking-age people. It's called the Elder Futhark, and it dates back to somewhere between 150 and 800 AD. These kinds of letters have been found on stones in Norway, Sweden, and Iceland. So, what are they doing in Oklahoma? Well, that's where the mystery starts. Some believe this stone is proof that Norse explorers didn't just land on the coast of North America. They traveled far inland, sailing down rivers and cutting across wilderness we didn't think they'd reached. According to this theory, they may have carved the stone to mark territory or leave a message. If that's true, it could mean rewriting major parts of history. But it's not the only explanation. A lot of historians argue that the runestone was probably carved by settlers in the 1800s. During that time, many Norwegian and Swedish families were moving into the Midwest and parts of Oklahoma. These people knew about runes, not because they were Vikings, but because rune writing was still taught in Scandinavian schools. It was part of their heritage. So, imagine this. You're a young immigrant in a new land, surrounded by unfamiliar language, landscape, and customs. Maybe you carve a runestone as a way of staying connected to your roots, something permanent, something that says, we were here. That's a pretty human thing to do. But the arguments don't stop there. One of the biggest sticking points is translation. What do the runes actually say? Most researchers agree it refers to a name, Glom's Valley, or Valley of Glom. Glom is thought to be an Old Norse personal name. It's simple but meaningful, like someone marking the land as their own. The strange part is that not all the runes come from the same time period. Some are clearly from the ancient Elder Futhark alphabet, but others seem closer to later rune styles, used centuries afterward. That kind of mix shouldn't happen. It's like writing a sentence today using a mix of Old English, Latin, and modern slang. You'd get your point across, but it wouldn't make sense to historians. That's why many scholars believe the person who carved the stone might have just been copying rune shapes without fully understanding the historical context, kind of like someone today getting a tattoo in ancient Greek because it looks cool, without realizing the grammar is all wrong. Still, it's hard to dismiss the effort behind it. This isn't a small rock in someone's backyard. It's massive, and the carvings are deep and precise. Whoever made this didn't do it casually. They were serious about leaving a mark. Whether they were a Viking explorer or a 19th century settler, they wanted it to last. Over the years, the Heavener Runestone has drawn curious visitors, amateur historians, and even TV documentary crews. Some are convinced it's the real deal, a remnant of Norse explorers who traveled farther than we ever imagined. Others see it as a fascinating but ultimately modern piece of cultural pride. And then there are those who just come for the mystery. What really makes the place special, though, is how it feels when you visit. Heavener Runestone Park is tucked away in the woods, surrounded by trees, birdsong, and quiet trails. There's a shaded overlook near the stone, and the whole area feels peaceful. You don't get the sense that someone's trying to sell you a legend. Instead, it feels like you've stumbled into something forgotten, something waiting to be figured out. When you stand in front of the runestone, it has presence. You can't help but wonder who carved it and why. Were they alone, working in silence? Did they have others with them, watching or helping? Did they think anyone would ever see it again? Some people say there's a kind of energy at the site, not spooky, just charged, like history is trying to whisper through the trees. You might not believe in that sort of thing, but it stays with you. Today, the site is protected as part of an Oklahoma state park. There's a visitor center where you can learn about both sides of the debate, the Viking theory and the immigrant theory, and they don't try to force one over the other. That's part of the charm. You get to decide for yourself. They even host an annual Runestone festival. Locals come together with food, music, crafts, and Viking-themed reenactments. It's a mix of Native American, Norse, and pioneer culture, all woven together in a way that feels surprisingly genuine. It's not about proving anything. It's about celebrating where stories collide. And there's one more thing worth mentioning. Some Choctaw oral traditions, the stories passed down for generations by the people who lived in this region long before settlers. Include tales of pale-skinned visitors from the east, tall strangers who came and went. These stories often get left out of textbooks, but they linger quietly in the background, adding another layer to the mystery. So, where does that leave us? Honestly, we don't know for sure who carved the Heavener Runestone. There's no clear evidence of Viking settlements nearby. No tools, no ships, no camps, just the stone that leans the odds toward it being carved by Scandinavian immigrants, not ancient explorers. But even if that's the case, it doesn't take away from its meaning. It's still a powerful symbol of identity, memory, and mystery, a link between cultures, continents, and centuries. It makes you stop and think not just about who came before, but about how we leave our own stories behind. In the end, maybe that's the real message of the Heavener Runestone, not proof, but possibility. Not answers, but questions. And that might be why people keep coming back. The Spiro Mounds in the quiet hills of eastern Oklahoma. Not far from the Arkansas River, there's a grassy rise that doesn't look like much from the road. It blends into the landscape, just another soft hill on the horizon. You could drive right past it and never know what's buried beneath. But under that slope lies one of the most important and most overlooked archaeological sites in North America, the Spiro Mounds. This isn't just a local site, it's the remains of a lost city, an ancient complex society that flourished long before Europeans set foot on this land. It had organized leadership, widespread trade routes, spiritual beliefs, and ceremonial centers that rivaled anything you'd find in ancient Europe. And yet, somehow, most people have never heard of it. Let's change that. The Spiro Mounds were part of the larger Mississippian culture, a civilization that once stretched from the Great Lakes down to the Gulf of Mexico and westward into the plains. These weren't wandering tribes. They built real cities with central plazas, raised mounds, wooden temples, homes, and places for ceremony and leadership. Their influence ran deep, spiritually, politically, and economically. They were a powerhouse. Spiro itself sat just outside what's now Spiro, Oklahoma. It was active between 800 and 1450 AD, reaching its peak between 1200 and 1400. During that time, it was a thriving city, home to thousands. But what sets Spiro apart from other sites isn't just its scale. It's what was buried there and what was lost. In the 1930s, a group of treasure hunters, calling themselves the Pocola Mining Company, bought the land. They weren't archaeologists. They weren't interested in history. They were after profit. What they found inside the largest burial mound, now called Craig Mound, was beyond anything they expected. Items made of copper with intricate human and animal designs, masks shaped like spirits and deities, thousands of pearls, marina shells, engraved effigies, ceremonial pipes, obsidian from the Rockies, mica from the Appalachians, woven fabrics, wooden staffs, objects that clearly held deep meaning. But instead of preserving it, they tore it apart. They used dynamite and shovels. They sold what they found to collectors across the country. Some of it ended up in museums. Most disappeared. By the time professional archaeologists were allowed on site, the damage was done. Craig Mound had been a sealed tomb, undisturbed for centuries. It was a time capsule, and it had been wrecked. But even with the loss, enough remained to tell part of the story. The people who built this city weren't just surviving, they were thriving. They had long-distance trade networks that stretched across the continent. Items found at Spiro, came from hundreds, even thousands of miles away. That means this wasn't an isolated community. This was a central hub. Politically powerful, spiritually influential, and culturally rich. Some of the most stunning finds were ceremonial. 1. A wooden cane or scepter carved with symbols might have been held by a high priest or political leader. There were copper plates shaped into human faces, showing expressions we can still read today: anger, pride, serenity. These weren't random decorations, they were messages. They carried identity, meaning, and belief. And that belief system wasn't limited to Spiro. Some of the designs match artifacts found at other Mississippian sites like Moneville in Alabama and Etowah in Georgia. The artwork is similar, the symbols shared. That suggests a unified belief system, a kind of spiritual language that stretched across the ancient Southeast. And then, almost suddenly, it was over. By the mid-1400s, Spiro was abandoned. The people left, the ceremonies stopped, the mounds were sealed, and the city was slowly taken back by the earth. We don't know exactly why. Maybe it was climate change, a drought that pushed people to leave. Maybe internal politics fractured the leadership. Maybe trade routes shifted. Or maybe the elite class lost credibility, and, with it, their grip on power. There's even a theory that the mounds themselves, once sealed, marked a turning point in their spiritual life, something that changed the balance of authority and belief. Whatever happened, it ended. And for hundreds of years, the site sat quiet. The local indigenous tribes remembered. Stories were passed down, stories of sacred places, of ancestors, of spiritual leaders. But when treasure hunters came in the 20th century, those stories were brushed aside. And now, with so many artifacts scattered or sold, we're left piecing together the past, with gaps that may never be filled. Still, Spiro isn't lost, not completely. Today, the site is protected by the Oklahoma Historical Society. It's the only public prehistoric Native American site in the state. You can walk through it. There's a small visitor center, a winding trail, and quiet mounds rising out of the prairie. Some are small, some stand tall against the sky. And when you stand beside them, something shifts. There's a stillness, a weight in the air, not oppressive, just present, like the land remembers. There's also been a shift in who tells the story. Tribes like the Caddo and Osage, who trace their lineage back to this region, are reclaiming the narrative. They're not just being spoken about, they're speaking. They're interpreting the site through their own traditions, reconnecting with the meanings behind the objects, the symbols, the structure of the city. And that makes a difference, because for too long, indigenous voices were left out of the story. Now, they're helping tell it. There are still so many questions. Who exactly was buried in Craig Mound? Were they seen as divine? Were their burials part of a larger ceremony? Why were some laid out in state, surrounded by treasures, while others were bundled or cremated? What did the symbols really mean? The winged figures, the masks, the animal spirits, and maybe the biggest question of all: what else could we have learned if the tomb had been left intact? Some researchers believe Spiro was more than just a ceremonial city. Its mounds might have lined up with the sun and moon, suggesting astronomical knowledge. Others think it held secret societies, or that its leaders had access to knowledge now lost. Religious, political, scientific, even the surviving artifacts push us to rethink things. The level of craftsmanship, beadwork, textile weaving, copper shaping is astonishing. Some of it looks like it was made with tools we wouldn't expect from that time. It challenges old assumptions about what native societies were capable of. And that's the point. They were capable of more than we have given them credit for. Visit Spiro today, and you won't find a massive tourist attraction. No flashing signs, no theme park crowds, just wind through the grass, sunlight on the trails, and mounds rising like echoes of something forgotten. If you take your time, if you walk slowly, breathe deeply, and listen, it feels like the past isn't gone, just quiet. And that quiet matters. The Spiro Mounds aren't just a mystery. They're a reminder of what was lost, what was stolen, and what still endures. The people of Spiro were never primitive. They were architects of a powerful, creative, spiritual world, and their story deserves to be heard. So, if you're ever near eastern Oklahoma, take the turnoff, walk the path, stand beside Craig Mound, and look out over the land. You won't see the city that was once here, but if you let yourself feel it, you just might sense its heartbeat. Because Spiro isn't just Oklahoma's hidden past. It's America's. The Anubis Caves, tucked away in the quiet grasslands of northwestern Oklahoma, Just outside the small town of Freedom, there's a cluster of sandstone outcrops that, at first glance, seem pretty ordinary. Just cliffs and cracks, shaped by wind and weather, like so many others across the plains. But if you walk closer, if you crouch down and really look, you'll start to notice something that doesn't quite fit. Carvings, symbols, figures etched into the soft rock, almost faded by time, but still there. And the deeper you look, the stranger it gets. Some of these carvings don't look like anything you'd expect to see out here. They don't match the rock art left by local tribes, and they don't resemble anything from the Great Plains tradition. Instead, a few look oddly Egyptian. There's even one figure that some say looks like Anubis, the jackal-headed god of the afterlife. Yeah, you heard that right. Anubis, in Oklahoma. That's what makes this place so weird, so debated, and, honestly, kind of unforgettable. People call them the Anubis Caves, and to this day, no one can say for sure who made these carvings or why they're here at all. Let's start with what we do know. The caves themselves are really just shallow alcovisic small rock shelters carved into the sandstone hillside. They're not deep or dramatic, more like natural lean-tos where someone could crouch to get out of the wind. But the rock is soft and easy to carve, and whoever came here left behind symbols that still spark arguments decades later. For a long time, the caves were just part of the background. Locals knew about them, but no one thought much of the markings. That changed in the late 20th century, when a group of independent researchers started paying closer attention. One of the most passionate was Bill McGlone. He believed these carvings weren't Native American at all. He thought they might be the work of ancient travelers from the Old World, possibly Egyptians, Phoenicians, or some other forgotten culture. McGlone and his team started documenting everything. They noticed how, on key days of the year, like the spring equinox or summer solstice, sunlight would pour into the caves at just the right angle to light up specific carvings. It wasn't random. The light moved in a way that made the symbols come alive, like part of some ancient celestial calendar. That idea led them to believe the caves weren't just shelters. They were observatories. And here's where it really takes a turn. They claimed some of the carvings matched symbols from ancient Mediterranean cultures. The figure that gave the caves their name was said to be Anubis, carved with a long snout and upright ears. Others looked like ram's horns, scorpions, suns, even zodiac symbols, things you wouldn't expect from plains rock art. One theory said the carvings told the story of Osiris, the Egyptian god who was dismembered and reborn. Maybe these caves marked his journey through the underworld. Maybe it was a sacred spot tied to rebirth, the stars, and the cycle of time. And that's where the big claim comes in. That long before Columbus, or even the Vikings, ancient seafarers crossed the Atlantic, made their way deep into the American interior, and left behind traces of their knowledge. The Anubis Caves, according to this view, are one of those traces. Now, that's a big leap, and not everyone buys it. Most mainstream archaeologists don't believe any of it. They say, the carvings are more likely modern, maybe from the 1800s or early 1900s, done by settlers, secret societies, or even just people playing around with old symbols. Others suggest the so-called Anubis figure is really just an abstract animal spirit, something common in native artwork, not proof of an Egyptian connection. And here's the problem. There's no reliable way to date these carvings. The sandstone is too soft for traditional dating techniques. No artifacts have been found nearby, no bones, no tools, no pottery, just the carvings themselves etched into the rock with no clear context. It's all speculation. But even if you strip away the theories, the experience of being there still feels different. Visitors talk about the quiet, how the wind rustles through the grass, how birds wheel overhead, how your footsteps crunch on the dry earth as you walk toward the cliffs. The caves are small, barely big enough to sit in, but when you crouch inside and let your eyes adjust, the carvings start to emerge. Some are faint, some are barely visible, but once you see them, you can't unsee them. And on certain days, when the light hits just right, a shadow will glide across the rock and land perfectly on one of the symbols, like it was designed that way. Maybe it was, or maybe it's just coincidence. Either way, in that moment, it doesn't feel accidental. Some people describe feeling a strange energy. They're not scary, just heightened. A sense that you're standing in a place that meant something to someone once. That whatever they carved into the rock was part of a bigger story we've lost the key to. And then there are the rumors, the ones that always follow places like this. Stories about secret knowledge, ancient maps, coded messages, buried treasure. Some people believe the Anubis caves are just one piece of a larger puzzle, part of a network of sacred sites across the Midwest, all linked by astronomy and geometry. It sounds like the stuff of documentaries and late-night YouTube dives. But then again, so does Egyptian carvings in rural Oklahoma. These days, you can't just walk up and explore the site. It's on private land, and access is limited. That's probably helped keep it intact. Honestly, there's no visitor center, no gift shop, no tour guides. The place exists in a kind of quiet middle space, known to the curious, unknown to most. And maybe that's how it should be, because the truth is, we may never know who made the carvings. Maybe it was ancient explorers. Maybe it was someone in the 1800s with an interest in Egyptian mythology. Maybe it was a mix of things, cultural memories blending together, symbols passed down and reinterpreted through the years. But the mystery still matters. It gets people asking questions. It gets people to look closer, to notice the way sunlight moves through rock, the way symbols echo through time. It invites wonder. And sometimes, that's more important than finding answers. The Anubis caves remind us that history isn't always neat and labeled. Sometimes it's just a whisper carved into stone, waiting for someone to notice. Maybe it's not about proving anything. Maybe it's just about feeling something. And out there, under the wide Oklahoma sky, with the wind in your ears and those quiet carvings at your feet, it's hard not to feel something. The Folsom-like artifacts at Cooperton, out in the quiet stretches of southwest Oklahoma, near the little town of Cooperton, there's a field you'd probably drive past without thinking twice. Nothing really stands out. Just dry grass, some scattered rocks, and a big open sky that seems to go on forever. It looks ordinary, familiar, but somewhere beneath that soil, something was waiting. Something ancient. Back in the 1950s, a local landowner was plowing his field when his blade struck something unexpected. A stone tool. It was sharp, long, and carefully fluted down the center, a type of craftsmanship you don't just stumble across. It looked almost exactly like the spear points made by the Folsom people who lived more than 10,000 years ago. That moment changed everything, because if that spear point really was Folsom, it meant people had been living in Oklahoma since the Ice Age. Let's pause here. The Folsom culture was first discovered in the 1920s at a site in New Mexico, where fossilized bison bones were found lying beside beautifully made, fluted spear points. That discovery proved, without a doubt, that humans were in North America during the last Ice Age. Before that, scientists weren't even sure. Since then, Folsom points have been uncovered in places like Colorado, Kansas, and Texas. They're known for their craftsmanship, thin, symmetrical, and incredibly sharp. These weren't casual tools. They were designed to take down massive animals like Ice Age, bison, and maybe even mammoths. So, when a spear point like that shows up in Oklahoma, it's a big deal, especially in a place as quiet and remote as Cooperton. That first discovery in the 1950s wasn't the only one. Other tools turned up in the same field. Scrapers, blades, more projectile points. They were all buried under several feet of earth. Some were chipped in that same distinctive Folsom style. Others looked a bit different, maybe a little later in time, but still made with that same level of skill. Here's where it gets complicated. Back then, archaeological sites weren't always protected. Most discoveries happened by accident, and unless a professional dig was done right away, the evidence often got lost. In Cooperton, there was no full excavation, no careful documentation of soil layers or tool placement. The artifacts were pulled from the ground, handed off, and the land went right back to being farmed. Without that full picture, it's hard to be sure exactly what we're looking at. But even with limited information, what has survived is pretty remarkable. Some archaeologists believe the Cooperton Point is a true Folsom artifact. Others call it Folsom-like, meaning it might have been made slightly later, maybe by a culture that came after the Folsom people but held on to their techniques. Either way, the craftsmanship speaks for itself. This was no casual hunter. This was someone who knew what they were doing, and that's what makes the mystery so compelling. Who were these people? Were they just passing through, or was this land part of their seasonal route? What were they hunting here? Bison, mammoth? And how far did they travel? We may never know for sure, but one thing's clear. The people who made these tools were deeply connected to the land. They lived by watching the sky, reading animal tracks, moving with the seasons. They didn't build cities or leave behind temples, but their tools, their quiet legacies, still speak to us. When you hold a fluted point like the one found in Cooperton, you're holding more than a weapon. You're holding the result of hours of careful planning and delicate craftsmanship. Every chip and groove was deliberate. This wasn't art for art's sake. It was survival, precision, intelligence. Imagine the person who made it, kneeling on that same land 10,000 or maybe even 12,000 years ago, wind in their face, watching the horizon for movement, shaping that stone not just with their hands but with knowledge passed down through generations. That's what hits you, the time, the distance, and the fact that, somehow, despite all the erosion and farming and development, that point stayed hidden under the soil, waiting to be found. But the sad truth is, we may have already lost our chance to learn more. With no excavation, much of the site was disturbed. Some artifacts ended up in private collections, others in university drawers. There's no local marker, no sign pointing the way, just a quiet field near Cooperton, like hundreds of others in Oklahoma. And yet, something still lingers there, a feeling, a presence. Because even without a monument or a plaque, that piece of land holds a chapter of human history that goes back farther than most of us ever imagine. Long before the Spiro Mounds rose from the earth, long before the Comanche rode these plains, long before the word Oklahoma existed, there were people here, and they called it home. It's easy to forget that when we're looking at empty landscapes. But places like Cooperton remind us that history doesn't always come with fanfare. Sometimes it's quiet, sometimes it's buried, and sometimes it waits for someone to notice. There's a strange kind of silence in that field today. Peaceful, but heavy with time. You wouldn't know you're standing on ground that might have seen some of the first humans to walk this part of the continent. There's no museum, no visitors center, just wind, grass, and sky. And yet, beneath it all, the story remains. A chipped stone, a hunter's hand, a glimpse into a world long gone. It makes you wonder how much more is still out there, under fields, in riverbeds, beneath cities forgotten, overlooked, but still waiting to be found. Because human history didn't start with skyscrapers or machines. It started with people like the ones in Cooperton, walking, hunting, adapting, and leaving behind clues. So, next time you see an open stretch of land that looks empty, think again. Cavern paintings near Alabaster Caverns, out in the dry hills of northwestern Oklahoma, there's a stretch of land where time feels strange. It's not just quiet, it's ancient. The wind carries that dusty kind of silence, the kind that makes you stop and listen without even realizing why. A few miles from Alabaster Caverns, where tourists line up to explore the world's largest public gypsum cave, there's another story buried in the rock. Older, quieter, and far more mysterious. Not many people talk about it, and honestly, most don't even know it's there. Hidden among the rock shelters and shallow overhangs near the caverns are markings, primitive shapes, symbols, and faint figures, either painted or carved into the stone. These aren't elaborate murals, like what you'd find in famous caves overseas. There are no full animal scenes or layered colors, just lines, spirals, stick figures. And yet, there's something deeply human about them, like the echo of a voice that's almost, but not quite, gone. Let's start with the part everyone does know. Alabaster Caverns State Park draws people in with its massive underground tunnel system made of rare gypsum. The white stone reflects light in this soft, eerie way, and some of it shimmers pink or black, depending on the mineral content. It's dramatic, cool air, tight passageways, and echoes that bounce back longer than you'd expect. Bats nest high above, and guided tours show off the formations carved by water and time. But just outside that main attraction, away from the tours, the ticket booths, and the picnic tables, is something much older, and you won't find it in the brochures. Scattered around the rocky bluffs are rock shelters, natural alcoves, formed over thousands of years. On the walls of some of these shallow caves are faded designs, made by hands we'll never meet. They've been worn down by weather, covered in dust, and, in some cases, nearly erased altogether. Still, they persist. And here's the question. Who left them? Archaeologists have a few theories. Some believe they were made by early Native American ancestors. Perhaps from the Plains Archaic period, people who lived thousands of years ago, long before contact with Europeans. Others think the markings could go back even further, made by nomadic Paleo-Indians who moved through the area with the seasons. The Cimarron River was a lifeline here, providing water, shelter, and food, and the caves may have served as gathering places or even sacred spaces. What's left behind is open to interpretation. Some markings resemble animals, bison, deer, maybe birds. Others are more symbolic, spirals, zigzags, sunbursts, or shapes that don't match anything we'd recognize. Then there are the human-like figures, stick people with raised arms, strange heads, or postures that suggest dancing, ritual, or trance. In a few places, you can still spot traces of red ochre pigment, barely clinging to the stone after who knows how many seasons of rain and wind. They aren't flashy. You might walk right by them, without even noticing. But once you do notice once, your eyes adjust and your brain starts to recognize the patterns. It's hard to look away. You start wondering who stood here all those years ago and what they were trying to say. No one agrees on a single meaning, and maybe that's part of what makes these markings feel alive. Some experts believe the paintings were part of hunting rituals meant to call animals or to give thanks before or after a hunt. Others think they marked the turning of the seasons or celestial events, sunlight hitting the wall just right during a solstice, like a prehistoric calendar. There's also the vision quest theory, that individuals painted what they saw during spiritual journeys in solitude. Imagine sitting alone in one of these caves, fasting, praying, waiting for a sign, and then painting a dream, a guardian spirit, or a warning. Whatever the reason, it was never casual. These weren't just doodles, they were messages. But over time, the trail gets messy. Because this area hasn't been fully protected or studied in depth, there's debate about the authenticity of some of the markings. Locals say a few carvings were made in more recent decades by settlers, cowboys, even bored teenagers. And it's true. Modern graffiti mixes with ancient lines. A spiral etched 2,000 years ago might sit beside someone's initials from the 1950s. There's no filter, no neat label telling you what's real and what isn't. That's frustrating, but it's also part of the story. Layered history like this is always a bit chaotic. And sadly, some of the oldest markings have been destroyed, either by accident or outright vandalism. Spray paint scars parts of the rock. Names are scratched across delicate surfaces. It's a quiet kind of loss. The kind that doesn't make headlines, but chips away at something irreplaceable. Still, what survives matters. There's something deeply moving about a person from thousands of years ago trying to leave a mark. Not for fame, not for recognition, but maybe just so someone in the future would know they were here, that they dreamed, or believed, or simply existed. And when you come across one of those ancient figures, even half-fated, it doesn't feel like history. It feels immediate. When you visit Alabaster Caverns today, the main cave steals the spotlight, and rightfully so. It's beautiful, vast, and surprisingly accessible. But if you step off the paved path and walk into the brush, out toward the weathered hills, you'll find something different. There's a stillness that settles into your bones. The modern world drops away, and suddenly, on the face of a rock, you see it. A mark, a figure, a faint red smear that could be a handprint, or an animal, or something else entirely. You can't explain it, but you feel it. It's hard to describe that moment unless you've stood in it. There's a strange quiet, a connection that slips under your skin. You start imagining the person who made that mark what they were thinking, what they feared, what they hoped someone someday would understand. We tend to think of ancient people as distant or unknowable. But the truth is, they weren't all that different from us. They looked at the stars. They told stories. They needed each other. They had dreams big enough to paint on stone. And sometimes, they left those dreams behind. That's what makes the unmarked shelters near Alabaster Caverns feel so powerful. Not the age of the rock, not the academic theories, but the quiet reminder that someone once stood exactly where you're standing and reached out with ochre or stone to leave behind a piece of themselves. We don't have to understand every mark. We just have to care enough to look, because every one of those faded paintings, every spiral or figure half lost to time, is proof that the land remembers even when people forget.